election post-mortem panel. My name is Zach Spicer. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Municipal. So what we have here today is some analysis of what was a very interesting local election. Most of our attention, of course, was focused on Toronto. We had Rock Ford, we had subways, we had a number of different visible races. There was also a number of very interesting events that happened outside of Toronto. So we have new mayors in seven of Ontario's 10 largest cities. Some cities, such as London, saw some incredible turnover with incumbents. There are 12 new faces on London City Council, and locally we have new mayors here in Kitchener and Waterloo, and we have a bunch of new faces on regional council as well. So what is the effect of some of these changes? What will government look like after this last election? And what we have here today is we've assembled a great panel to help us analyze some of these election results. With us today, we have Andrew Sancton. Andrew Sancton is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Western Ontario. He's a former chair of the department and the former director of the local government program. He's written numerous books and articles on urban government and politics, and he's considered one of Canada's leading experts on local politics, governance, and administration. His latest book is the second edition of Canadian Local Government, an Urban Perspective. We also have Gabriel Edelman, who is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto School of Public Policy and Governance, where he teaches classes on urban governance and public policy. He received his PhD from the University of Toronto and held his Shirk postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Western Ontario. He's a recipient of the Vincent Lemieux Prize for Best Thesis from CPSA. He's also recognized as a Clarence Stone Scholar and a Norton Long Young Scholar from APSA. And finally, we have Deborah Chapman, who teaches in the Global Studies and North American Studies program here at Wilfrid Laurier and the University of Waterloo. She received her PhD in 2009 from the University of Western Ontario. Her first book, The Struggle for Mexico, was published by McFarlane and Company. And Deborah brings not only a wealth of academic experience to our panel today, but also some practical experience. She was a candidate in the 2010 Kitchener municipal election in Ward 9. So with that, I'll call up our first panelist, Gabe.
So thank you, Zach, for the invitation, and thank you everyone here. We have nosebleed seats in the back. This was not expected. This is kind of great to see. I'm going to say it's for the other two guests, and then also I will forget that it's required for some students. Just to make myself feel a little better. So my job is to summarize the Toronto municipal election campaign, throw some observations on the table. This is really kind of a pundit's job at this point because it's only a few days after the election. There's not a lot of hard empirical research yet, although that's starting to come out now. So I'll throw a few ideas on the table and as well as some questions. But first, just a rundown in case you haven't been paying attention. People in Toronto think we're the center of the universe, so we believe that everyone's been paying attention. In this case, there's a better chance than in other elections that people have been paying attention, not just locally but around the world. So, the Toronto story is very much a story about Rob Ford and his brother Doug Ford. It's also a story, though, about Olivia Chow, main contender, and Mr. John Tory, who ended up winning the election. And the title here is a tagline used by Doug Ford during the campaign as kind of an attack. And what's the story, Mr. Tory? He was using his radio and TV spots, trying to criticize Tory that he didn't really have a plan. He wasn't telling any information about what he was going to do. We'll get into that. But a basic summary, the contenders. Municipal elections are very long, at least in Ontario, and these were the contenders, at least at first. So these illustrations I did not design myself. I wish I did. This is pulled from a website called pollinide.org, and I would, especially for the students in the room, I'd encourage you to go check it out. I think they're trying to start in Chicago with Chicago, and they just did it for the Toronto election. It's a primer, so you get to know the candidates, and they do a really creative job of presenting the different platforms for each candidate. And I got in touch with the illustrator, and I had his permission, and I told him I'd plug him. His name is Sean Tanner. He's from Vancouver. He's a fantastic illustrator. There it is. So this is the contenders at first. You may not have heard of some of these contenders. David Soknacki, he was a former city councillor in Toronto for Eastern Scarborough Ward, and the eastern edges of the city for 7 years or so, until 2006, 2007. He was the chair of the budget committee under the former mayor, Mayor Miller, and he ran this campaign as an outsider, as a fiscal conservative in terms of prudent fiscal management, because he was part of the budget committee. But he really picked up a lot of steam among urban progressives, got a lot of innovative policy ideas in a place like Toronto to suggest that you should ban all street parking on streets in order to improve transit operations and kind of improve the flow of traffic. So he had surprising support among a dedicated core of people. Karen Stintz was a local city councillor up until the end of this past term. She was the chair of the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission. She made a name for herself standing up to Rob Ford at council during the midpoint of Rob Ford's first term. She essentially spearheaded a change in terms of the transit planning to push a light rail plan, an LRT plan, as opposed to the subway plan, and then flip-flop, turned around, and then pushed for a Scarborough subway, which the Fords then claimed as their own. And then we have the three main candidates. John Tory, most of you know, former progressive conservative candidate at the provincial level. He also ran for mayor of Toronto in 2003, losing to David Miller. Olivia Chow, very well known, of course, wife of the late Jack Layton, prominent NDP MP at the federal level, and then before that she was also city councillor for many years at the local level. And then, of course, everyone knows Rob. Don't even have to say Rob Ford, just Rob. And I think everyone knows what he stood for, at least what his messaging was, which was save taxpayers' money, and he had a couple of characteristic on the outside that no one paid attention to, that we won't pay attention to today. That was kind of the field early on, say February, March. Later on, Soknacki and Stintz drop out. They were looking at the polls, reading the polls, and we'll get to the polls in a minute. And they decided they really have no shot. Rob Ford was a super personality, a super celebrity. Chow and Tory were at that level, at least at the local level, to be able to compete in terms of name recognition. Soknacki and Stintz had a real tough time connecting with a lot of people. Most of the electorate knew who these three were. They didn't know the others, so it was an uphill battle for them, so they dropped out. And then you were probably following the news, hopefully you were. On election day, we had a switcheroo. The brothers Ford switched around, a tragic event, of course, with Rob falling ill, being hospitalized, and his brother Doug took the torch and carried on with the Ford name. So that's kind of the backdrop. So let's look at the campaign storyline. This was the final result. Tory won with 40%, Ford with 34%, and Chow with 23%. And let's take a look at how that kind of evolved over time. So I'm not usually one to pay attention to polls that much, but in this case it's useful to look at polling data from foreign research, mainly because they were the one polling firm that did pretty regular polls out in the field and consistently throughout the course of the campaign. So you can look at trends over time. They have consistent methodologies, things as academics we're looking for, so even if you don't believe the numbers. And the numbers on election day, some of them were within the margin of error, some of them were not, and we can get into that afterwards. But this is kind of, these are the trend lines throughout the course of the campaign. It tells you a little bit about the story. So, some important dates, some key dates going through. March 12th, Olivia Chow joins the race. And she had great name recognition, very prominent local councillor I mentioned, but obviously also at the federal level. And at this point in time, when she jumped into the race, she was leading the polls. She was the front runner. Everyone believed she was going to take it in a landslide. She was the anti-Ford vote, and so she was leading the polls at the time. Then some strange things happened. Rob Ford checks into rehab, April 30th. Completely out of the blue, no one expected this. And he was in rehab until the end of June, so a 2-month period. During that time, his polling numbers plummeted to the lowest point in the campaign. By the end of June, he was polling at around 20%. Now, for the people who don't follow Toronto politics, who would say, how is someone in rehab, after all he's done, still polling at 20%? Well, he has a very dedicated core of loyal supporters. So he's still at 20% support, that Ford Nation, that strong core there. But you know, overall, the trend line was downward And Olivia Chow at that time was still doing fairly well. And here is a really critical turning point, which is what most pundits and then academics as well will have to make sense of. And I don't think I have a good answer for you of exactly what happened, but I'll mention a few possible ideas. Early July, late July, something happened. This is where Olivia Chow's support in purple starts plummeting and never really stops. And John Tory starts rising. And so there are a couple of different ideas of why this is the case we'll get into, but that's a real turning point in the election. And it's important from a comparative perspective, because most of the time in municipal elections, people assume that people don't pay attention to municipal elections. It's the least important election. Voter turnout is consistently lower at the municipal level. Well, here's a case where the election, you might argue, was settled in July, not in September or October. And that's something different, at least from past elections. So that's an important moment for the campaign to point out. But when do you want me to end? Because I could go for a while. Just trying to pace myself. Okay. Then we have the dramatic turn of events. This was craziness in Toronto. I was getting calls left, right, and center for people asking me to predict what was going to happen. No one had any idea what was going to happen, whether Rob's votes would go to Doug, etc. Rob was tragically hospitalized, diagnosed with cancer. Doug, on September 12th, the last day that you could take your name off the ballot or put your name on the ballot, decided to say, I'm going to do it for Rob. Ford Nation deserves to have Ford on the ballot. So Doug took his place. And incredibly, this is just 6 weeks before Election Day, by October 6th, 3 weeks before Election Day, Tory and Ford were in a statistical tie. Now this scared the pants off of a lot of people who despised Ford. But Ford Nation, you could argue, was growing. Remember that Ford Nation at this point was down to 20% in the polls, and now it was above 35%. So there was definite momentum in the Ford camps. Ultimately, on Election Day, Tory's vote held. Ford jumped a little bit from the last polling figures over here, and Chow's was a little bit below. So those are the trend lines, and some key markers there, just as some background. So three questions stand out from this, and we'll come back to them if we have time, maybe in the Q&A. So what happened to Olivia Chow in early July? By the same token, what happened to John Tory in early, late July? What is it that stuck in his campaign that got people voting for him? How did he manage to take the lead? And what put Tory over the top at this point? In early October, when statistically speaking, we were in a deadlock, and yet Tory still managed to win the day at the end. We'll get back to those questions. First, let's see how that vote shook out. So this is research by a good friend of mine and colleague, Zach Taylor. We've done this in previous campaigns, and he very quickly, within days of the election results coming out, got the primary source data from Elections Toronto at the polling district level. So you may have seen different maps on websites or in newspapers showing ward by ward who voted for who in the Toronto race. This is down to the polling station level, and that's very critical because wards and ward boundaries don't matter in a mayoral race, right? So we think of neighborhoods as wards, and that's what we do for our local council races, but for the mayor, it's at large. And so if we're trying to get a sense of who exactly, as individuals, voted for a specific candidate, we have to go to the smallest unit possible, and at this point, the polling stations is the smallest unit possible. There's more you can do in terms of individual level surveys, and there's a Toronto election study that's being conducted now through Western that will be able to get more precise data, but at the moment, this is the best we have. Now that's a little bit hard to make sense of, so I'm going to kind of disassociate it, disaggregate that a little bit and show you support for each candidate one by one. So this is Chow's support, again at the polling level. So you see concentrations in the center of the city, but not overwhelming. The only place where it was overwhelming, say over 80%, this is the Toronto Islands. There are, let's say, 100 different homes on the islands, little cottages. This is not a very populous area, so it is really inconsequential that her support was so high there. Can anyone guess, we're at a university here, can anyone guess what this is? Sorry? York University had a very strong concentration of Chow support, but nothing elsewhere. In general, there's a lot of white on this map, all around, and even in the central areas where Chow received a lot of support, in the West End, immigrant communities, gentrifying communities with young progressives and young urban professionals, was not overwhelming support. Ford, on the other hand, had very concentrated support in the northeast and southwestern portions of the city. This is Scarborough, the inner suburbs of Scarborough, and this is what you would normally consider Ford Nation, northwestern Etobicoke. His ward when he was local city council. Very high concentrations, particularly in the West End, and very low concentrations through the downtown core, but also the central core, North York especially. So if I were to put a map from the last election, you'd be surprised that I don't want to say the Fords. They did Fords. They kind of come as a team. But Rob received obviously extreme concentrations of support in his home base, but also around the city. So you would have seen surprisingly a lot of support in the core as well in the last election. Not so this time. Tory took that support, especially in the spine of the city along Yonge Street. But notice, and this is key here, is if you want to win a Toronto mayoral election, you also have to receive support outside of your base. And that's what Ford, I was mentioning, did with the downtown core last time. And it's hard to see with this projector, but you have 20, 30, 40, 50% in outer reaches, even in places where Ford had very high numbers. Tory was coming in as a pretty strong second, not necessarily competing at that polling station level, but you had significant amounts of votes there, and that's really what put him over the top. So if we were to compare all three candidates, this kind of helps you get a sense more than that first map I showed you, of really where those concentrations, those geographic concentrations of support were. So I only have 30 seconds left, so I'll throw one idea on the table, and you might have heard of this before. When I look at these two maps in particular, I can't help but to think of David Helchansky's research. If you've studied city politics at all, and particularly in the Toronto area, David Helchansky is a researcher at the University of Toronto, and he's looked at income polarization in the city of Toronto, and he's come up with this term, Toronto as a divided city, and there are three cities in Toronto. Areas in blue are areas that over time, over the last 35 to 40 years, average incomes have grown at a rate greater than 20% than the average across the city. And areas in red are essentially areas that are becoming poorer and poorer. And you can think back to the previous slide, Tory support maps onto city number one, well-off area, mainly white, and Ford support maps on fairly well to areas in red here. So these parts of the city with lower income groups, higher immigration rates, higher immigrant populations, etc. So I'll leave it at that as one observation. I can get into more, but that is the one that really jumps out at this point. And we don't know for sure if the correlations are indeed as strong as kind of the visual connections that we can make. But that analysis, I'm sure, is on its way, especially by people like Helchansky. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Gabe. That was fantastic. I'm going to call upon Andrew Sankey. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Zach. It is a pleasure to be here talking about elections with this group. And like Gabe, I appreciate your attendance here, even if it was under some duress. And we'll try to make it interesting. I'm glad to have followed Gabe in for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think I subconsciously knew that he would have some sort of pyrotechnic slides, because I've seen his presentation before. I instinctively decided not to have any slides, but I now know exactly why. It was because Gabe would be here. And then given that he used those slides from Zach Taylor, the combination of Gabe and Zach on slides is something that nobody in their right mind would ever compete with. Fortunately, what I'm talking about here doesn't have to do with geographical variables, because it's simply not relevant to what I want to talk about. The other thing I want to say in introduction is I'm actually originally a Montrealer. I still think of myself as a Montrealer. But I have to admit, I've lived in London, Ontario now for more than 35 years, so I guess I have to kind of admit to being a Londoner. But as a Montrealer, I was brought up to have no use for Toronto. And, but I do have to acknowledge now that I mean, we do need to know what's going on in Toronto. Toronto is important in itself as the largest city, in the largest metropolitan area, the largest city region, and the largest municipality. So we need to know about it. Nobody needs to know about London, Ontario. So what I want to talk about here is some general lessons that I think are relevant to municipal politics generally about what happened in London, and maybe for all I know, relevant to any kind of politics. Another contrast in my presentation with Gabe's is that it's significant that Gabe made no mention at all, I'm sure it's time constraints, no mention at all of the council races. He just mentioned the wards, but he didn't mention how incumbents did very well in Toronto. Only one incumbent was defeated, and there was a handful, 4 or 5 or something, who didn't run. And you can't get elected if you don't run. 6, he said. So what I'm talking about, as Zach mentioned at the very beginning, is something entirely different. It's a situation in which incumbents really did badly, and that's what I want to sort of talk about. So even if I am taking London as a kind of a case, typical case, in a way, not taking it as a kind of a typical city that you don't have to know about, but can learn interesting things from. And when I first moved to London, everybody talked about it as it was a marketing place, a trial marketing place. You know, it was sort of supposed to be typical enough that you could launch some new product there. I think Tim Hortons launched dark roast coffee first in London. That's what we were told, anyway. So you know, it's supposed to be kind of, and although it is in bad times now, right? It's probably typical. It's not in good shape, which is a bit of part of the election story. Anyway, you do have to know a little bit about it. It's got 1 mayor and 14 councillors, 1 councillor per ward. In this last election, the number of incumbents that didn't run was proportionally higher than in Toronto because 5 incumbents did not run, and the mayor didn't run either. The mayor who was elected last time was under house arrest, that's why he didn't run, but even the mayor who replaced him didn't run either, so we had no incumbent mayor. But 5 incumbents did not run. Now this is kind of a footnote, a tangential comment here. 3 of the incumbents who did not run were women, each of whom had served 3 terms. They were a team called the Killer Bees, because their all the last names started with B. And I was on the Rogers TV coverage on that night of the election, and was beside one of the Killer Bees, who's actually the current mayor, and she was complaining about how women were not doing so well in the election, how there were more women in the last council. And I couldn't help saying that if you're an incumbent woman and you decide not to run because you think there should be a kind of self-imposed term limits, you do have to think about conflicting principles here, right? One principle is women should be on municipal council. Another principle is people shouldn't be on council for more than 3 terms. The Killer Bees decided that the term limits principle, I think, was more important than the continued women representation. I'm sure they worked hard to get more women elected, but the fact is there are fewer women as a result, but there would have been more women if those 3 had run, because they surely would have been re-elected. That's the end of the tangential comment. Anyway, until June of this year, the London City Council has been controlled by a faction on City Council that had a majority. They were called the Fontana 8, because there were 8 of them, led by the mayor who was elected last time, Joe Fontana. Fontana resigned in June because he was convicted of fraud and sentenced to house arrest through the time of the election. Of the incumbents who did not run, only 1 was a member of the Fontana 8. So most of the Fontana 8 were running again. But all of the remaining members of the Fontana 8, and obviously Fontana wasn't a remaining member, but all of the ones who were left and who were running were defeated. This is pretty monumental, that you could have that much of a clean-out of a particular faction. Perhaps even more significant was the fact that one of the members of the Fontana 8 ran for mayor. He had been on council for about 30 years. He had quite a record of achievement, very important in the revitalization of downtown London. By all measures, an accomplished city councillor. He got less than 5% of the vote. He turned out to be kind of a fringe candidate. And that was, in as many ways, one of the most graphic illustrations you could possibly have of how much the Fontana 8 were repudiated. Some of the Fontana 8 who lost were seen from the beginning as being in trouble. There were strong candidates against them, and they were, some of them had done some dumb things during this. One seemed more concerned about having chickens in backyards than any other issue that could possibly be imagined. But there were other candidates who were on the Fontana 8 who'd been there in the council for decades, had relatively strong records, and nobody expected them to lose, but they lost anyway because the whole thing was cleaned up. 4 members of the council, including the mayor-elect, were re-elected to council. And of course, none of those people were members of the Fontana 8. So this dramatic defeat of the Fontana 8 makes me think about 2 related features of municipal politics, 2 general features that I want to sort of focus on. The first has to do with incumbency, and the second has to do with the role of political parties, or the non-role perhaps. So it's a cliche to say in my line of work that incumbents have a huge advantage in municipal politics. I think the reason Gabe didn't mention it in his presentation because he kind of took it as a given that councillors in Toronto are going to get re-elected. But there has been some work on this in the United States, and there always has to be an important caveat to the thing about incumbents getting re-elected. Incumbents get re-elected if they don't badly screw up. If you screw up badly and you're incumbent, then you can actually lose. You can lose badly. That's what the evidence shows. Not just that you lose badly. And that's exactly what happened in London. It also happened, I haven't looked all over Ontario, but it happened to the mayor of Brampton, Susan Fennell, who got into all kinds of expense problems. It also happened, I remember, after the Rim Park fiasco here in Waterloo almost a decade ago or so now, when all the councillors who were associated with that and the mayor, as I remember, were defeated. Now, if I can just go back to Toronto for a second, you might have thought that with all of Rob Ford's problems, that there would have been councillors who were associated with him in some way who would have attracted a sort of negative attention because they were so, they supported Rob Ford in some sense. But I think the point about Rob Ford is he didn't have permanent supporters. There was no Rob Ford party. There's a Ford Nation, but it's not Ford Nation in the city council. So most of the councillors very ably were able to disassociate themselves from Rob Ford, even though on occasion, maybe quite frequently, they voted with him. That was not the case with the Fontana 8. The Fontana 8 were clearly identified, and the local media made sure that people knew who the Fontana 8 were. Now, it's important to know that in the context of what I'm going to talk about next is that Joe Fontana, the mayor who was elected last time, was a former Liberal, capital L Liberal, member of Parliament and cabinet minister under Paul Martin. When he got elected in 2010, he clearly used his sort of federal experience, his parliamentary experience, to build a party at the local level. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that the Fontana 8 ran as a group in 2010. They did not. But Fontana put together the coalition, which is kind of what you'd expect, what I would expect a mayor to do. I mean, people talk now about and mayors having to, and John Tory even going around talking to councillors, firming up support. But he did it in a way that once he got to 8, I don't think he cared what happened after that. So if everybody else was going to be opposed to him, that was fine, and that's sort of what happened. So that leads me to this discussion of parties. And unfortunately, we don't have survey data about why people didn't vote for the Fontana 8. But I want to suggest 4 possible reasons. The first is that Fontana turned out to be a criminal, and people didn't want to vote for people for councillors who supported him in office. The second possible reason is that the Fontana 8 took decisions on development issues that were unpopular. They clearly was a pro-development council. They approved sprawl-like measures, and there was a lot of environmental opposition to that. Now, whether that really would attracted a lot of votes that attracted anti-Fontana 8 votes, I don't know. But the London Free Press helpfully presented near the end of the campaign about a list of 4 or 5 issues that the Fontana 8 had voted on that were matters of substance. And some people clearly would have not liked that. Other people, of course, think that power centers and new shopping centers and sprawling development is a good thing, in part because it does provide jobs, at least temporarily, which are badly needed in London. A third possible reason, which is dear to my heart, but I won't get into it now, is the fact that the Ontario Ombudsman said that the Fontana 8 had an illegal secret meeting at least once and probably on other occasions, and that this violated the open meetings provisions of the Ontario Municipal Act. So they were, the Ontario Ombudsman has a lot of public presence, and if the Ontario Ombudsman says people did something wrong, and if you're looking for reasons to vote against a group of people, this is a good reason that the Ombudsman, and actually the Ombudsman, I'm going to get going, the Ombudsman tweeted that he was hoping that there'd be a clean out of the London Council. This is our neutral Ontario Ombudsman who's serving the public interest. Anyway, don't get me going, I already know myself going on that. But the fourth possible reason is that people simply didn't like the idea that there was such a thing as the Fontana 8 on the municipal council. They didn't think it was appropriate that council was somehow divided in that way. Of course, in Canadian politics, in Ontario politics, in parliamentary systems, we have caucuses, we have organized parties, we expect parties to vote against each other in the council. But there's a long-standing tradition going back to the turn of the 20th century that somehow that kind of politics is inappropriate at the municipal level. Now, as I said, I don't have any hard survey data, I don't have any survey data at all on this, but I suspect that was part of the reason why everybody got turfed. They just didn't like the idea that there was such a group, because there was talk about, we want an end to this factionalism. We just want people to not get along all the time, but not to be divided in this almost formal way. So in fact, I think it was a combination of all 4 of those reasons. But in terms of the lessons of the London election for municipal politics generally, it's that last one about people's conceptions of the role of factions or parties that I think merits our attention as people those of us here who study municipal politics. I'm not going to make any predictions for the future, except that it looks like we're kind of heading into an era of good feelings, because most of the councillors who were elected are on the sort of center left or left. and it's going to be very interesting to see how they treat the London development industry and environmental issues and that kind of thing, because there'll be a lot of conflicting pressures. The other thing that I don't know about the party affiliations of all of the new council members, but there is a very strong, still, large L liberal presence. And I am pretty sure that all of these councillors are going to be kind of running away from their big L liberal, did I say big L? I meant big L liberal connections. Matt Brown, who comes from a very liberal, big L liberal family, had, of course, blue signs in his election campaign. And so, you know, I think this kind of thing will be perpetuated itself. Nobody's going to admit that they're part of larger political groupings. I think we've got some very politically ambitious people on who are elected, and it'll be interesting to see whether they get along as a team or whether some of them try to distinguish themselves from the others by taking some dramatic steps one way or another. Anyway, that's it for London. And then we'll take some questions.
Thank you, Zach, for inviting me to participate in this panel. Well, Kitchener-Waterloo isn't as interesting as Toronto, and London has its own history. But I'm going to start off by first talking about the difference in the way Waterloo region is structured, because we have a two-tiered system here, as I'm sure many of you are aware. So we have first the regional government, and then we have the city councils themselves. The regional government is made up of all of the mayors that are elected in the 7 municipalities, plus representatives from Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge, and then of course the regional chair. So there are 8 directly elected councillors, the city mayors themselves, and the chair. The biggest issue that arose during this election was at the regional level and for the regional chair election itself, where the LRT, which was an issue that came up in the 2010 election, came to come back to the table, where some candidates were arguing that it should be stopped. Others were saying, as most of the councillors throughout the region were saying, that it's a done deal, so why are we wasting time on this? But it did come to be a very heated discussion between two regional chair candidates, Sealing and Isa, who were sort of the top 2 contenders. As far as city councils are concerned, in the Waterloo region there are 7 city councils. So we have the city of Kitchener and Waterloo and Cambridge, but then we've got 4 townships. So we've got Woolwich, Wilmot, New Dumfries, and Wellesley. In total, on all of those city councils, there are 40 councillors that are elected and 7 mayors. And then during this election also we had the public school board and separate school board elections. In total, there were 78 positions to be filled, including the regional council and the municipal council and the school board. There were 240 candidates all told on nomination day in the region. Of those, 178 of those candidates were running in the city council and regional council elections, and those are the ones I'm going to focus on. I'm not interested in I won't talk about something I'm interested in. I'm not going to talk about the school boards. So what were the results? How do I do this?
Just warming up.
So I've got here a table of voter turnout in the elections, but you have to keep in mind as we look at this and compare. I've got the 2006 voter turnout results in 2010 and then the 2014 results. But what's interesting, what we have to keep in mind when we look at these are, in 2010 there was an amalgamation referendum. asking whether it was held in Kitchener and Waterloo, so the question was, should we amalgamate? As it turned out, the no vote won, so that was the final result, and that's why we still are not amalgamated. The other referendum was water fluoridation in the city of Waterloo. So I'm not suggesting that this in any way impacted voter turnout, because one could argue that if it had, these numbers would be voter turnout in 2010 in Kitchener and Waterloo. In particular, certainly Kitchener would have been much higher than the 27%, which it wasn't. We also have to account for the fact that in 2010, the Kitchener ward boundaries were changed from 6 to 10. So whether that had an impact or not, again, I'm not suggesting it did, but it was another reality during that election period. In Wellesley, we noticed a very low 11.49% turnout, and the way that can be understood is that there were no, and everyone who was elected was a solo candidate, so there's no opposition in any of the council races or the mayoral race. So that explains that 11.49%. And in 2014, the only other sort of variable that we could add to the sort of analysis is that in Cambridge, they tried online and phone voting, which were the only places within the region that actually used alternative forms of voting. It didn't seem to have much of an impact on the voting turnout results, although in Guelph, where they also used online voting, there did seem to be a much bigger impact on the results. They're not reflected here, but so as we can see, the voter turnout hasn't changed much, even with all of these changes, which is something that I'm not going to pretend to analyze, but I wanted to point this out. So what happened on election, throughout this election process? There were 5 new mayors elected in Waterloo region. One of them was because he was defeated, which I'll get to in a minute. The mayor of Woolwich was defeated. And the other 4 were a result of retired mayors. So the mayor of Waterloo retired, didn't run again. Kitchener was the same. The mayor of Wellesley retired, and the mayor of New Dumfries retired. So that's a lot in this region to have that many new mayors elected in one go. There was also, I looked at the gender divide of the female candidates of the 56 seats that we're looking at here. 16 of them were female, and 40 of them were males. So the female success rate was about 29% of the full pool of candidates, and the male candidates were about 71%. As far as incumbents were concerned, 10 female candidates were re-elected, and in the male camp there were 23 incumbents, so that was about a 62% re-election of the male incumbents, the female, and 57% of the males. Another interesting thing arose, or I thought was interesting anyway, with what I'll just categorize as name recognition. It actually was a topic that was discussed a bit on the CTV or CKCO news. I don't know when it was, but anyway. And some of the candidates were interviewed, and a number of them said that yes, name recognition was a big thing. A couple of them said that it was irrelevant. But what was interesting about the different candidates that ran in this area, Karen Redmond, who was a Liberal MP from 1997 to 2008, came back and ran at the regional council level. Wayne Wettlaufer, who was also an MPP, 1995 to 2003, was also successful in running for a regional chair position. Neither of them had been on regional council. Well, I think Karen Redmond was years ago, and I'm not sure about Wayne Wettlaufer, but the interesting thing is that they were coming back from provincial and federal politics back into the municipal realm. A third candidate who also had experience in the federal level was Andrew Talegi, but he did not win. And there were also 5 local media celebrities, 4 of which were elected. So we had Frank Etherington. If anybody knows my story, he was the guy at TV. by one vote in 2010. And he's a newspaper journalist. And let me just point out that he'd been in the media for 38 years, so he should have beaten by a long shot. Melissa Durrell, who is a TV reporter, she was acclaimed, but she was elected initially in 2010. Again, a personality who had been in the public eye for many years. Dave McDonald, who did not get re-elected. He was a weatherman on the local TV station. Dave Schneider and Brian Burke, who were both radio personalities, and if I'm not mistaken, I'm not a hockey fan, but David Schneider was also the Kitchener Rangers voice or announcer at the hockey games. So we had a number of celebrities and name recognitions that could certainly have favored them in the election results. 4 councillor seats were acclaimed, including Melissa Durrell, who I just mentioned. The others don't really matter who they were, but I'm not sure how that compares to other elections, or whether that's a high number or low number, I'm not sure. We didn't have a Ford Nation here in Kitchener-Waterloo, but we did have a few small little scandals, I guess we could call them. Todd Cowan being probably the most important one. He was a Woolwich mayor. He was not re-elected, although he was determined to keep his name in the pot. He was accused of double billing months before the election, where he was billing the region and the township and Grand River Conservation Authority. And I think the final figure that I came up with was an overbilling of about $3,200, which isn't a lot of money when you think of what that could be in a city like Toronto or possibly at a different level of government. Another, not so much a scandal, but certainly something that the media picked up on was that one of the regional chair candidates, John Wolfe, and his history of criminal activity. So he was had charges against stolen property, possession of stolen property, theft under $5,000. He's actually scheduled to appear in court on December 1st. A breach of probation that came out from November 2012, being charged with failing to keep the peace, etc. So his criminal record was certainly high-lit. Another somewhat interesting event emerged with one of the mayoral candidates in Kitchener, Dan Glenn Graham, who was a city councillor in Ward 10 and this time around then for mayor in Kitchener. He said he didn't do it, but somebody from his team sent a message to a candidate in Ward 2 telling him he should withdraw from the election process and make room for another guy who he was supporting. And this turned into a bit of a media story because it was, as it turned out, the person who had been asked to withdraw his candidacy was from Afghanistan, Indian Canadian, and he basically refused to accept the apology of Dan Graham's camp and refused to withdraw from the election. So that was something that we weren't really familiar with here in Kitchener during election time. I then tried to look at some of the different campaign strategies that were used in this election. Robocalls was a very new thing for this region. I mean, it's happened at provincial and federal elections, but here at this level, there were actually 4 candidates who used robocalls to get their message out or to call different events. One of them being a regional councillor, 2 regional councillors, the mayor of Kitchener, a mayoral candidate in the city of Kitchener, and one of the regional chair candidates. There was also an increase in social media, the use of social media, whether through Twitter or Cameron Dearlove, for example, was one of the candidates that I would say that ran a very strong social media campaign, as did Dave Jaworski, a large candidate, mayoral candidate. And then, of course, they had the candidates use the typical signs and pamphlets and door knocking and phone calls, etc. Some of the issues that were talked about and sort of focused on during this election, as I said, the LRT, which was kind of an interesting one because when I was knocking on doors in 2010, that was the hot item. Even though I was running for city council, it was sort of the thing that everybody wanted to know what your position was. So as a good politician, I would say, well, that's a regional issue, that's not a municipal issue. But it was a very controversial issue then, and it seemed to have come back now to be a hot item to talk about. Taxes always emerge, and you know everybody or candidates say, well, we're going to try and keep the taxes below the inflation rate. But of course, if you start adding things up like property taxes, from if we start at a baseline, the inflation rates are about 7.1% a year, and we start adding on property taxes, stormwater fees. What else do I have here? Well, urban homes. Anyway, the numbers add up to a lot more than 7.7, although some will debate that's not the case. In fact, sealing the current regional chair and the candidate that won in this election tried to stand firm and say that no, we keep our inflation rate or our tax rate below the inflation rate. So that's always an issue. Debt management, the region doubled its debt since 2009 to over $500 million. That came out in the news today. It was at 432, and they just took on a larger debt, and that now sets them at $500 million debt. Buzzwords that were used throughout the campaign are things like inclusion. Nobody said what they meant by inclusion or how they were going to ensure inclusion, but it certainly came to be a word that was used over and over again by many of the candidates. Transparency is another buzzword that how they're going to ensure transparency is unclear, but it's certainly a word that gets used over and over again. And the third word that I would throw out there is accountability. What do we mean by accountability? And how is it going to be ensured? GO trains from Kitchener to Toronto and Cambridge to Toronto was also a hot topic, although really municipal governments have nothing to do with that. It's a provincial responsibility, but it showed that people are concerned about transportation, and it came up with the LRT and it came up with GO trains. The desire for people to get around easily. Out of the coal program here in Kitchener-Waterloo, during this election period, 5 of the coal programs were shut down. These programs were mostly run in churches, all but with volunteers, for the most part volunteers ran these programs. The reason that people withdrew from the program, the volunteers, they were saying that there were too many mental health issues that they couldn't manage, and that there were too many addiction problems, and that they also expressed concerns with volunteer burnout, and the programs were literally shut down from one day to the next. A few days before the election, the YWCA came forward and said that they would set up another coal program for, I think, 80 people or something like that, which with the already existing programs that existed, that this would solve the problem. But this came to be a big issue: affordable housing, what to do with the homeless people and homeless problem here in the city, or in the region. When it comes to affordable housing, there are both regional housing facilities and municipal housing facilities. When it came to the Out of the Coal program, it was kind of interesting because I happened to be on a community advisory committee called the Safe and Healthy Community Advisory Committee. And we had representatives from the Out of the Coal programs come and speak to us in the advisory committee, and they had some really good suggestions on what could be done with the Out of the Coal programs and how it could be managed. And at the end, I could go on a rant, but I won't. At the end, what was done is we'll defer to the region. So the advisory committee itself was advised by the city representatives who participate in this advisory committee to sign an agreement that we would direct the Kitchener City Council to defer to the region. So it was kind of a a politics of deferral, as I call it. And this happened not just with the Out of the Cold program, where the city refused to take a position on things, but also with the CETA agreement, where the city of Kitchener refused again to take a position, where some municipalities said, we don't want to be part of this agreement and we'd like to have our agreements removed. Quickly, other issues that were talked about were job creation. This is always a big issue here in the Waterloo region, especially with the closing down of many manufacturing companies. More community gardens arose on a number of platforms. The concern of conflict of interest. This arose around the LRT, but there was, I was approached by a number of people on the Kitchener City Council trying to get me to run, and they said, you know, you could get Etherington on that conflict of interest. They spend this $500,000 washing in his front yard and he doesn't declare conflict of interest. So saying, you know, are there other conflicts of interest that there could be out there that where councillors aren't declaring them, they're not required to. It's up to them to declare conflict of interest, but nobody's going to hold them to it. And then the airport, which also came up in the media. We've got a Waterloo, I don't know what it's called now, Waterloo Regional Airport, which is an international airport, and there's talk of expansion, yet at the same time airlines are withdrawing, etc. So those are just some of the things that I'm not sort of giving me my analysis of where I think things are going to go, but that's sort of a summary of how I view the local election.